Good afternoon, everybody. If I could have everybody's attention. Thank you. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ellen McKenzie. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Health, and I want to welcome you all to this month's Dean's Lecture. This is always a special time of the month where we get to celebrate our newly and not so newly promoted and appointed professors. As I've said this before, we have a little bit of backlog. So we have professors who were promoted a year ago, and we're just now getting around to having them give lectures, but we're thrilled nonetheless. Earning the rank of professor, as we all know, is a huge accomplishment and an incredible achievement, and I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to celebrate these achievements with you. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Katherine Clegg Smith, or better known to her friends and colleagues as Kate Smith. I've always liked that name. Fantastic name, Kate Smith. Kate is a sociologist by training with research interests in understanding the social determinants of health behavior. She is also an expert in applying qualitative and mixed methods to addressing important public health problems. Her particular areas of expertise are in the communication of health information and the lived experiences of people with chronic conditions, and she also has a general interest in identity and its relationship to health. Before coming to the Bloomberg School of Public Health in 2003, Kate was an assistant professor as an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. She was a research specialist with the Health Research and Policy Centers at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was promoted to professor in 2016 and holds active joint appointments in the Krieger School's Department of Sociology and the School of Medicine's Department of Oncology, as a lot of her work relates to cancer. Kate also directs the Center for Qualitative Studies in Health and Medicine, a center which she was instrumental in getting up and running here at the Bloomberg School and on the medical campus. She was an author of the highly regarded and influential NIH Best Practices in Mixed Methods Research for the Health Sciences and has authored over 150 peer-reviewed publications. Kate has been recognized as an exemplary and much revered teacher. She received the HBS Student Organization's Teaching and Mentoring Awards and was honored by the department with an award for outstanding faculty devotion to students. She teaches classes that explore the use of sociological theory and qualitative methodology in public health research. And she also runs the MHS in social factors in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. Kate received her Master of Arts in Sociology from the University of Leeds and her Doctor of Philosophy and Sociology from the University of Nottingham. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katherine Clegg Smith.
Thank you, Dean McKenzie, for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you to all of you for coming and spending this time to me. It's really meaningful. So I was cleaning out my attic a few weeks ago, and some of you know this, and I found the job ad that I responded to in relation to the assistant professorship, which was actually in health policy and management in 2002. And further down on this piece of paper are some notes, and I'm not going to show you, as to why I thought I might apply for this job. But my most acute recollection is that I applied and told almost no one, thinking that no way in my wildest dreams could this ever happen for me. I also told myself what I imagine many of our students tell themselves as they apply to their dream jobs. Kate, insert your own name here, you need practice writing applications, and, well, experience on a campus visit would be great. It doesn't matter that you'll never get it. Just apply. And yet, here I am today, and it's been an amazing journey from there to here, and I feel so lucky to have this opportunity to give a Dean's Lecture and to be part of such an important field as public health and to work as such a part of such a wonderful institution as the Bloomberg School. So what I'd like to do today is spend some time talking about the specific skill set that I bring to public health, both theoretical and methodological, and try to explain a little bit about why I think these skills are important, and the role that I hope that they have played and continue to play in the engine that is public health, The work that we do as a collective, so that we may promote health and save lives, sometimes, not always, millions at a time. And I don't personally save anyone, but my hope is that my work helps us to understand who it is that actually needs to be saved. And perhaps maybe even get us to stop for a moment and ask questions about why we feel that they need to be saved, and from what or from whom. And only when we're confident that the saving is necessary, that we seek to better understand the nature of the threat posed, and how people themselves see it, and how they're likely to engage with any solutions that we can offer. So the first part of this talk is going to set the theoretical foundations for the work that I do, as well as touch on methodological questions, because for me, those things go hand in hand. And then I'll dip into the perspective, how these perspectives has shaped two diverse areas of my work that are long-standing and ongoing, my work in tobacco control and in identity and health. And then briefly describe an area that I'm currently beginning, to work as part of a national network of qualitative researchers to build and disseminate a database of people's health experiences. I come to public health as a medical sociologist. My research agenda is somewhat unusual in that it's not acutely concentrated on one issue, and I'm much less concerned about this now that I have tenure than I was beforehand. Rather, the constant that runs through most, if not all, of my work is that a sociological lens is the bringing of a sociological lens as it is applied to and within public health. The passion that drives my work is not a specific health concern, but rather the theoretical underpinning of sociology and social constructionist theory in particular, as it can be applied to improving people's lives, particularly in relation to avoiding ill health and having as positive experiences of treatment and life thereafter as possible. I know that there are some people in this room, hopefully not many of you, who've never taken a sociology class. So I thought that I should begin by providing just the briefest of overviews of how a sociologist sees the world, what they potentially bring to the public health table. And anyone who's taken more than one sociology course will perhaps cringe at the sweeping statements that I'm about to make. But I'm used to this tension, having taught here for 15 years. The sociologist C. Wright Mills wrote of the sociological imagination as being the driver of sociological work. The sociological imagination, according to Mills, is the awareness of the relationship between personal experience and the wider society. We walk through the world experiencing our own life and the lives of those in our social circles as individuals, as unique beings, and this is how it should and must be. The sociological imagination, however, pushes us to take a step back and consider individual experiences as being shaped by social forces, both current and historic. I often use an analogy of being up in an airplane and being able to see when you're up there order when you look out of the window. Whereas we all know that when we're down on the ground, we can't see this order. And things may seem chaotic when we're in the thick of things that taking a step back doesn't seem quite so. For several years, I taught undergraduate medical sociology here at Hopkins, and one of the textbooks that I used for this class was written by Kevin White in 2002, and in it I found a very useful description of the perspective that sociology and sociologists bring to endeavors to promote and protect health. White said, "There is no one-way determinism from nature and biology through to the individual and society. Rather, for sociologists, it's the structures of society that shape who will get sick, how they will experience their condition, how they will be diagnosed and treated, and how they will recover. The sociological imagination is what we as sociologists use to keep remembering to think along those lines, to ask questions that lend themselves to better understanding such patterns, and how to use the insight gained to improve the experiences of those impacted." Social constructionist theory is one branch of sociology. The work in this tradition is actually less focused on the big social patterning of conditions and more on the world in which we find ourselves, the everyday world that we all take for granted, and how it's in very many meaningful ways formed by social processes. Before social constructionism was developed as a formal theory by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman in the mid-1960s, the premise was outlined by W.I. and D.S. Thomas in 1928, who stated that if men define situations as real, then they're real in their consequences. To take a few examples, we might think of concepts as distinct as beauty on the one hand and an illegal act on the other. In both instances, it doesn't take much imagination to see how societal assessments and determinations are central to the definition of a condition or act in such a way as to have important consequences for an individual or a wider social group or community. We know from historic considerations of art, as well as cross-cultural comparisons, that notions of beauty are socially bound. And we also know that they are very much experienced as objective and real. Beauty has important consequences for one's life experiences. Whether one is seen as being beautiful impacts how people assess and interact with them, which in turn has meaningful impacts on people's life chances. Oops, I'll get to the cow in a minute. Similarly, and for those of you who are students here, you know where the cow's going. The determination of an act as illegal or legal is the result of social deliberation and actions, and the implications of such determinations may entail potentially critical consequences for people who engage in behaviors that are determined one way or the other. So now to the cow. Students who've taken my Sociological Perspectives class will recognize this photo as I show it every year and we take time to talk about it, but we don't have that time today, so I'm going to cheat and tell you how this conversation goes. The question that I pose as a demonstration of a social constructionist perspective is to ask students to think about the possible meanings of the object in this photo, and it's not a trick question, it's a cow. They talk about the object as a food source, a source of milk or beef, as potentially as an income source, as a display or a determination of wealth, as possibly a sacred object, or alternatively, as a source of pollution. And all of these meanings are real and they make sense from some person's point of view. And it's actually incredibly easy to see how any one of these meanings might be incredibly important to someone. But if you hold one view, it's not really possible to fully hold another. And the important thing is that the physicality of the cow, its reality, so to speak, is not at any time challenged by these differently held meanings. The duality that this speaks to is core to social constructionist theory. Herbert Blumer is the Chicago School sociologist who first outlined how objects don't in fact have inherent meanings, but rather the world is made up of objects whose meaning is determined through social interaction. And more recently, Peter Conrad and Kristen Barker in 2010 described this as follows. Reality does not just exist out there in the world waiting to be discovered, but is created by by individuals who act in and towards their world. The full premise of social constructionism is outlined in Peter and Berger's book on the topic from 1966. They outline that the world is a product of social interaction, while also emphasizing that the world is not amorphous or easily redefined by one individual or a collective. To quote Berger and Luckman, every individual is born into an objective social structure within which he encounters the significant others who are in charge of his socialization. These significant others, for him, are imposed on him. Their definitions of his situation are posited for him as objective reality. He is thus born not only into an objective social structure, but also an objective social world. So hopefully, this is at least somewhat interesting to some of you. It's the branch of sociological theory that my work is most influenced by, the idea that our world is very real to us, and the world within which we find ourselves and within which we act is not easy to change or redefine. But at the same time, from a sociological perspective, all of the objects in that world, be they physical, social, or abstract, come to have their meaning determined through social interaction. Again, to draw upon the words of Berger and Luckman, the world of everyday life is not only taken for granted as reality by the ordinary members of society in the subjectively meaningful conduct of their lives, it's also a world that originates in their thoughts and actions and is maintained as real by these. But how does this relate to public health? Now I'd like to briefly describe 4 key social constructionist concepts that are central to much of the work that I've done and that which I feel are very pertinent to public health as being impactful and effective as we'd all like it to be. And these concepts are framing and agenda setting, medicalization, and the concept of social roles. For the concept of framing, let's use the visual of a painting or a photo in a frame. The idea of framing is that for any situation, there are decisions to be made as to what's pertinent information, what's in and what's out, and where one's focus is appropriately set. When it comes to public health, how issues are framed and who does the framing and with what end result is key to understanding how a problem is understood, who's seen as having a legitimate voice and looking for solutions, and what solutions are seen as feasible. Much of my work around framing has been in relation to tobacco control. How is the problem understood, and what impact does this have on the solutions offered? And what role does the tobacco industry, as well as public health agencies, have in shaping this? Agenda setting theory is closely aligned to framing, and it's essentially the idea that there will always be too many possible issues for any individual person or profession, such as public health, to attend to at any given time. Rather, certain issues will make it onto an individual's or collective agenda as something worthy of attention, and certain issues will not. From a sociological perspective, it's important to note that such determinations do not happen randomly, but are the result of social acts, with certain actors more able to make their voice heard and their will felt than others. So a social constructionist can use agenda setting and framing theories to take a critical look at public health efforts. What issues are we attending to, and why? Who are we working with, and who are we not? What solutions are seen as possible? Medicalization theory is another theory that's concerned with the processes by which human problems and experiences become understood as medical phenomenon. The question of how a problem becomes understood and treated as a syndrome or an illness. And medicalization theory posits that any physiological or psychological experience can be understood within medical terms, or not, and that such a determination has very important consequences for people who are undergoing the said experience. Medicalization theory was developed by Peter Conrad in the late 1970s and 1980s. I'm getting the update is ready to install image up here, which is frightening me a little bit. So if this should go away, I will cry for a moment and then carry on. And it's humbling to say that this was part of Peter Conrad's dissertation efforts, but anyway, he developed medicalization theory around what was then known as ADD, attention deficit disorder, and he outlined the processes by which behaviors that were once understood as being the acts of unruly or ill-disciplined children became understood as a medical condition, and he theorized the processes by which this redefinition occurred and the role of the availability of a pharmacological remedy in this process. He also outlined the implications of a medical definition for a set of human experiences in terms of access to services, potential alleviation of stigma and blame, but also the reality that a person who is identified as having a medical condition is then subject to medical control. Medicalization theory brings attention to the increasing likelihood of understanding of experiences of deviance within a medical framework. The concept of deviance as applied in medicalization theory is particularly focused on people who are in some way outside of the population norm, people who find themselves at one end or the other of the bell curve of human experience, people who are too short or too large, who don't sleep very much or who sleep too much, people who are not able to have children, people who do not enjoy social interaction or enjoy it too much, are all understood within medical terms in ways that they've not always been. Questions as to whether obesity should or should not be considered a disease, for example, or how violence prevention fits within a public health framework can be informed by a consideration of the application of medicalization theory to experiences that fall within the public health purview. Paula Lance is another sociologist who works within public health, who stresses that we should be mindful that when we adopt a medicalized concept for a condition, we don't limit our consideration of potential solutions to those that are at the individual level and medical, but that we also remember the impact of the social context on complex conditions. In terms of public health, I think it's helpful to think about the potential applications of theories of medicalization and the consequences of a medical definition for a set of experiences to our increasing focus on the identification of people who are at heightened risk for condition X, Y, or Z, and to our ever-expanding capacity to identify genetic predispositions to disease. Certainly, such a focus and attention to prevention are laudable goals, but we should also be mindful of the implications of an expansion of the medical lens to ever greater aspects of people's lives and ever larger parts of the population. And finally now to social roles. Sociological theory prioritizes the collective context for an individual's experience. And there's a branch of sociological theory, known as structure functionalism, that emphasizes the ways in which our lives are actually incredibly ordered. We are all individuals to be certain, but we also act as part of a collective, with our actions being guided by social scripts and schema that provide us with clear guidance both as to ways of thinking and behaving that outline what is possible and appropriate within a particular social context. Theorists from this tradition tend to present such schema as absolutely necessary and point out that we couldn't function either individually or collectively if we had to determine at each instance all of the possible interpretations or actions that we could undertake. Rather, life only becomes possible if we know what to expect from someone when we interact with them on the basis of their relationship to us. Are they a friend, a rival, a grandparent, a teacher, a police officer, and so on? Similarly, we need to understand how they see us. We all espouse social roles, and in fact, multiple roles at any given time, and these roles are important in shaping how we see ourselves and how we act, as well as how others act towards us. In much of my work, I'm interested in better understanding the extent to which people's health-related experiences shape their sense of who they are, what's possible, how people see them, and consequently, how they might behave and with what outcomes. Such questions tend to lend themselves to prioritizing the perspective of any given individual, to trying to understand the world from their point of view, to collecting detailed data from a smaller number of individuals. In the conduct of qualitative research, we see value in collecting people's stories, to looking at the world as the complex place that it is. And now I'm going to move on to little bites of my current and future work, hence the Top Us photo. And those of you who know me know that I'm very motivated by good food and such. This was compelling to me. So the first area of my research that I'm going to briefly describe this afternoon is the work that I'm doing around the use of cigarette packs to shape how smokers and potential future smokers think about the product and make decisions that have capacity to greatly impact their health. I've talked a little bit about framing, and so I'll frame this aspect of my work first in personal terms. I am named after my two grandmas, Katherine and Martha. One smoked heavily when one did not, and I lost the smoker, Katherine, when I was only 10, whereas my other grandmother got to be a part of my life up and through much of my young adulthood. My granny, Clegg, Kitty, died from diseases that are clearly and explicitly tied to her smoking. And maybe we didn't know enough then, although that's very debatable, about the dangers of tobacco use, but we do now, and yet tobacco products continue to be promoted increasingly in countries and in communities where there are fewer resources to resist and fight back. Tobacco continues to be the leading preventable cause of death and kills more than 7 million people a year globally. And although there have been amazing successes in tobacco control, population growth and intense efforts on the part of the tobacco industry in low and middle income countries means that the absolute number of smokers globally is not yet on the decline. And 80% of the world's 1.1 billion smokers live now in low and middle income countries. And there's a place for social constructionist perspectives in public health and identifying and understanding the messages that are being conveyed about tobacco use in order that public health can effectively work to inform those messages and shape them into ones that are more likely to protect rather than harm. My first 5 years working in public health were focused on the role of the news media, as is illustrated by this slide, in shaping public perceptions of tobacco and tobacco control, as well as people's receptivity to progressive tobacco control policy. I'm now very fortunate to work with Professor Cohen and many others who are here today on the TPACS project, the Tobacco Packaging Surveillance System, which is funded by the Bloomberg Initiative to Reduce Tobacco Use. One of the areas of considerable success in tobacco control has been the ability to greatly constrain the venues in which tobacco companies can market their products and associate the act of smoking and the various cigarette brands with powerful images and concepts that equate smoking with success, style, glamour, coolness, power, and so on and so forth. Cigarette sponsorship and promotion used to be ubiquitous. On TV and movies, on billboards and sports, on clothing, you name it, it was there. You may not remember that Fred and Barney used to enjoy a Winston at the end of their day, and that Lucy and Ricky were a Philip Morris couple, but they did and they were. There's documentary evidence that tobacco companies spent almost $5 million on product placement for tobacco products in movies between the years of 1979 and 1994, which is meaningful to me because those are pretty much sum up my peak movie watching years, at least the years when I so often wanted to emulate the on-screen characters that I saw. Between 1965 and 1994, there were 600 movies that have been shown to be engaged for product placements related to tobacco, including 180 PG-rated movies. And ones that stood out to me were movies like Splash, The Goonies, Bill and Ted's, Dead Poet Society, movies that I watched 10 plus times, perhaps, each. With increasing attention and pressure, policies have been put in place that restrict these promotional opportunities. And as a result, the tobacco pack becomes ever more critical real estate upon which to communicate both with the smoker as well as those who are in his or her presence. The United Nations Framework on Tobacco Convention on Tobacco Control, Article 13, calls for restrictions to marketing and advertising of tobacco products. And Article 11 calls for clear communications of the dangers of tobacco use through packaging. In TPACs, our core, oops, I'm not supposed to get to that. Hold that. Forget that you saw the really attractive pack. In TPACs, our core purpose is to conduct surveillance research on the implementation of health warning label policies. Our data help to demonstrate whether or not tobacco companies are adhering to countries' policies to use the pack to communicate the dangers of tobacco use and limit the ability of companies to build brand identity. The tobacco pack, as is displayed here, is a battleground for tobacco messaging. And this pack is a camel pack that we bought in Mexico in 2013, where the company and tobacco control, I think it's nicely illustrated, are vying for attention. This graphic of various Marlboro packs from countries with different policy contexts shows the industry and tobacco control, again, working hard to effectively communicate via this medium. On the top are packs where I would say the tobacco companies are winning. We see Philip Morris's emphasis on the iconic Marlboro chevron, but also the addition, and it doesn't really show up here nearly as well as if you actually hold the packs, of the bright color bursts. And actually the middle pack has a hologram to convey the capsule that is in the cigarette stick that you can push and get a burst of flavor. And this is actually a pack that Professor Cohen picked up in Cape Town as on sale there. Below you see Marlboro packs in countries where tobacco control is more in control of the messaging space. On the left is a pack from London, a Marlboro pack from London that I bought on my way to Cape Town. And in England there are now plain packaging laws. In the middle is a pack from Nepal, which has graphic warnings on over 90% of the front and back of the pack. And on the pack on the right is Australia, a pack from Australia, which was the first country to pass plain packaging laws. Our goal in the TPACs project is to provide in-country advocates with the data that can help inform their policy efforts. Our data demonstrate the capacity for companies to adhere to the stringent health warning label policies, but also high levels of variability in compliance by country as by parent company, brand family, and the socioeconomic status of the neighborhoods where the packs were purchased. We work to disseminate and provide data in ways that are applicable to policy efforts. And here are extracts from 2 of our fact sheets on compliance with health warning label laws in Brazil and India in 2016. We're also able to identify areas where policies perhaps need to be strengthened. We note ways in which the industry is possibly adapting to policy innovation. And here is work that we did to show just how important the cigarette stick is itself in communicating branding information. As countries are being compelled to use the pack to more prioritize public health messages, so they have the potential, if we don't attend to it, to use the stick. Our work demonstrates that the association between demonstrates that the association between tobacco use and sports, which was so prevalent in sponsorship activities, is continuing to be made on the pack, both in terms of images and brand names, and there is potentially more work to be done in this area. We're also very interested in the ways in which the tobacco industry is continuing to market products in ways that speak to new segments of the market, such as young people and in many countries, women. Our work is seeking to understand how the pack is being used to potentially hide the dangers or minimize communication of the dangers of smoking, suggesting that certain brands are less harmful, and also continuing to build the association between smoking and concepts of independence, freedom, luxury, and a powerful life, all of which we know to be diametrically opposed to the actual impacts of tobacco use. These are all areas where a social constructionist perspective becomes critical. A social constructionist perspective allows us to consider how smoking becomes associated with femininity and glamour in some contexts. We're also asking questions about what images and concepts appeal to young people in different parts of the world, and to question our ability as researchers who are not in that demographic and who are located in Baltimore rather than in the settings that where our work is focused. How able are we to appropriately assess this? So these are packs that, according to our protocol, our coding protocol, were identified as potentially appealing to youth, but we also are aware that we may have missed some things, and these were packs that were not coded in such a way, but may be appealing to young people. And so what we're now currently planning is a follow-up study in which we'll use qualitative as well as quantitative methods to elicit feedback from young people about various pack attributes. And we're starting this work in Mexico and then possibly moving to other countries. So now I'm going to switch gears and move to my work in cancer survivorship. Great strides in cancer detection and treatment in the US have brought us to a place where there are more than 33 million people around the world who have survived more than 5 years after a cancer diagnosis. The impact of a cancer diagnosis on one's sense of self is neither predetermined or universal, but rather socially constructed. Not so long ago, a cancer diagnosis was generally understood as essentially as a death sentence, and cancer was a highly stigmatized and feared condition. Given the very welcome shift to an expectation, at least in some context, for people to now live a life well beyond cancer treatment, I've become interested in health promotion and effective health care for people who have such a cancer history. And my work in this area began with an interest in understanding how the experience of a cancer diagnosis and treatment might impact one's sense of self and readiness to engage in future health promotion efforts, particularly given that we know that people with a cancer history are at elevated risk for both recurrence and comorbidities. And the data that I'm going to speak to today are largely taken from one of the papers from this project that I worked on with many colleagues, but particularly Dr. Ann Clausen, who's here today, that was published in the Journal of Cancer Survivorship in 2015. Individual sense of self and definition of meaning of having cancer are constructed through the processes of composing and sharing cancer experiences and expectations within a specific social context. And over the past 30 years or so, the concept of survivor has become one available identity to adopt following a cancer diagnosis. And importantly, research has shown that the espousal of the survivor identity is related to positive health outcomes and well-being. Research has also shown, however, that the concept of cancer survivor is likely more salient within certain communities and for people who've experienced certain types of cancer than for others. In other words, there are many more pink ribbons worn than blue or white, and some women are more likely to garb a pink ribbon than others. The association between identity and behavior is complex and highly important to understand if we are to intervene effectively to promote health. Highly salient identities, such as being a cancer survivor, may push people to engage in behavior change so that their actions match their sense of self. For example, if one espouses a survivor identity, that may imply to self and others a focus on living life to the fullest and having fought or won, which in turn may push one to consider both major and minor life choices so as to be considered consistent with this self-concept. One of the things that we noticed about much of the literature when we began to be interested in this topic and work in this project about a decade ago is that the work tended to consider identity, the existing literature tended to consider identity related to cancer in isolation from other aspects of people's lives. Studies that I saw didn't consider other identities that people may or may not adopt and how these might relate to the saliency of any identity related to health experiences. And from sociological theory, I knew that identities are not monolithic, and as a qualitative researcher who seeks to embrace rather than control for complexity, I saw potential value in taking a somewhat different approach than research had done before. So through our research, what we set out to do is to conduct exploratory mixed methods research around the dietary behaviors among long-term cancer survivors. And we enrolled 53 people in our study who'd been diagnosed with either non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or breast or prostate cancer at least 3 years prior. And the study involved conducting 2 qualitative interviews with our participants, one before and one after they completed a series of 3 24-hour dietary recalls. We also collected structured data from the participants at baseline, and for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to focus on the data collected at the first qualitative interview, where we explored identity and how cancer priorities did or did not factor into this. So just before we began our first qualitative interview, after having participants complete some basic structured questionnaires on demographics and health-related behaviors, we conducted a form of free listing exercise by providing people with a basic sheet of paper with 10 lines on it and the question, "Who am I?" at the top, and asking them to fill it in however they like. Each participant's responses to the Who Am I free listing exercise were then entered into a spreadsheet in the order for which the responses were provided, and two study authors, myself and a doctoral student, Keisha Koa, conducted a hybrid thematic analysis pile sort in which individual responses such as mother of 2 grown children, wife, nature enthusiast, part-time teacher, enthusiastic, cancer cheerleader, etc., were grouped into categories. And the emerging groupings included relational identities, occupations, hobbies and interests, personality traits, and cancer-related concepts. Essentially, what we found was that cancer wasn't all that important to how these people thought about themselves 3 years or many more post-diagnosis, even in the context of a study that they knew related to their cancer history. None of the participants provided any cancer-related terms as the initial term to describe themselves in the Who Am I exercise. Rather, only 10 of the 53 respondents included any mention of cancer survivorship as any of their 10 possible descriptors. Of the 20 men with a history of prostate cancer, only 1 mentioned cancer or survivorship. And in this case, survivor came after happily married, American male, African American, and grandfather. One woman with a history of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma described herself as a cancer fighter after describing herself as a mother and a grandmother. The pile sort process of the terms generated through the Who Am I exercise resulted in the identification of 4 concepts that were more prominent and typical than cancer-related terms. Those were the relational concepts, occupational concepts, personality traits, and likes and hobbies. And these concepts put forward illustrative context of the importance of relationships, life stages, and non-health facets of life in people's self-concept. Shortly following the Who Am I exercise, we asked participants to articulate what they understood by the term cancer survivor. And this question yielded a wide variety of responses, which we subsequently grouped into a broad typology of survivorship definitions. Factual, defined by passage of time, the idea that cancer's been beaten, being lucky or blessed, a functional definition, having dealt with adversity, or a temporary state. Just pull out just a few examples. And finally, we asked people whether or not they identified as being a cancer survivor. And what we found was not all interviewees espoused the cancer identity. Some explicitly rejected survivorship in terms of how they either thought of themselves or presented themselves to others. Others presented a complex, multifaceted view, which showed that the concept served some limited utility to them, often and only in certain times or situations. Several interviewees espoused the survivor identity by articulating how the very fact that they'd had cancer made them a survivor, whereas others referred simply to having had cancer in the past versus no longer having it presently. And such factual presentations of the survivor identity also drew upon a normalization of this concept, such that people seemed less to be actively choosing this identity for themselves, rather as not explicitly rejecting it if others defined themselves in this way. If others defined them in this way. There were also other people, who described a decision to adopt a survivor identity not as a given, but as resulting from a defining cancer experience. For such individual, they were a survivor because life was no longer the same after cancer, and the survivor identity resulted from some meaningful change that had occurred to them. A theme to emerge among some women with a history of breast cancer was that the action of cancer survivorship is sometimes related to new connections and roles pertaining to being a part of a broader survivorship community. However, many interviewees did not associate with the idea of being a cancer survivor, and some explicitly rejected the idea of any kind of label, whereas others expressed specific reluctance to identify as a cancer survivor because they didn't want to identify with the disease, whereas others thought that there was very limited, if any, positive outcome from an identity that was shaped in relation to a health condition. And finally, there were some individuals who weren't easy to categorize in relation to their survivor identity. They distanced themselves from this identity not because they rejected this notion outright, but rather on the basis of the time that had passed since their cancer experience. As their cancer experience became less salient, so this idea of a survivor identity also faded. Several men with a history of prostate cancer gave accounts in which they both accepted the idea that on some level they are cancer survivors, while also providing an explanation of why the survivorship concept was not applicable to them. These men's explanations included the idea that their cancer experience was not sufficiently onerous compared to people who'd had different kinds of cancer, as well as not wanting to engage in or being seen to engage in advocacy efforts. So whereas prior studies have largely treated cancer survivor as a standalone identity to either be adopted or rejected, our research illustrated how one's cancer experiences are appropriately considered in the context of numerous possible elements of one's identity. The experience of being a stigmatized or championed person for one's cancer experience sits within an ongoing context of identity as mother, wife, bird watcher, part-time accountant, and so on. Effective health promotion throughout the survivorship identity is predicated on connecting with people, and prior research has found identifying as a cancer survivor to be a protective factor. Efforts to categorize people as either espousing a survivor identity or not may therefore have limited utility without explicit consideration of how and when one's self-concept in relation to cancer might shift. The saliency of other aspects of self, specifically important relationships, personality features, occupation, and likes and hobbies, might be well considered both in terms of appeal and the possible influence that these will have on engagement with any health promotion messaging or other interventions. Our analysis led to more questions about exactly how the survivor identity serves to protect. And we suggest that it may be because this identity is appealing for a subset of people with a cancer history who are already in an advantageous position, and for whom the addition of this identity is consistent with existing self-concept. Alternatively, it may be that there's something protective in the very act of identifying as a survivor in terms of the behaviors that are associated with such an identity, and possibly the sense of community that it implies. And we suggest that there's need for more research that can disentangle whether a survivor identity is a marker for existing protective factors or a possible intervention goal. So now I move on to the third and final example of the application of social constructionist theory in my research, and that's the work that I'm beginning to engage in as part of the Health Experiences Research Network, or Hearn. In Hearn, we're working to build and disseminate an online repository of patient experiences using a model of qualitative research that's been developed by researchers at the University of Oxford over the past 2 decades. Too often, when people are newly diagnosed with a condition, sources of reliable and comprehensible information are difficult to find. Patients and their families may not know what to expect as someone begins treatment, or how life might look a few years down the line. Similarly, there's also a concern over medical providers who may have little insight in what it's like to live with a condition because they have very limited purview of their patients' lives other than what they see in the clinical context. And moreover, patient information that's presented on the internet is often of somewhat limited utility because it's either anecdotal or because it's presenting a particular perspective because it's been compiled for commercial purposes or for advocacy purposes by a group or an organization that's looking for change in one direction or another. As I outlined earlier, qualitative methods provide the structure and space to prioritize the perspective of people who have lived with a condition or within a set of circumstances, and to do so in a systematic and scientific way. In the Hearn initiative, we're working as a national network of qualitative researchers to gather and disseminate reliable information about health conditions based on stories told by a sample of ordinary people intended to adhere to the principles of maximum variation, collected and analyzed in ways that are understood and shared by teams of trained qualitative researchers. That's our network. That's most of us, not all of us. And that was from training that we undertook in Pittsburgh late in this year. And you can look for several people from Hopkins, from both from HBS as well as from epidemiology. The UK site on which our work is modeled has now more than 85 informational modules on health conditions that provide the voices and perspectives from a full range of experiences in relation to these conditions. And in 2015, the compelling case for doing this in the US is that the UK website had over 5 million users, approximately 40% of whom accessed it from a US site. The Oxford group has also published more than 100 research papers from their work, and in this way they're peppering the scientific literature with patients' perspectives. And we feel that similar work is important to do here because in order for people in the US to be appropriately served, there's a need for a site that provides US-based experiences, which is why we've embarked on the work that we're doing. And we're at the early stages, and doing research like this in a country like ours offers distinct challenges in terms of geography as well as population and health system diversity. However, we've made a robust beginning, and let me show you what that is. So this slide illustrates the work that we as a network have either completed, are currently undertaking, or have funding to begin in the next 3 years. This work is clearly and explicitly socially constructionist in its nature. Personally, I'm working with a team here at JHSPH to construct a model on the experience of older adults living with cancer-related fatigue. And I'm also about to embark on interviews for a module that's led out of the University of Wisconsin on cancer and genomics, where we will talk to people with, who either have had a cancer themselves with a known genetic component or whose family history of cancer puts them in a position of heightened risk. And in the coming years, I'll also be leading a module to better understand the experience of participating in clinical trials. And we're expanding this, this network of activities every as we go. And this research is seeking to understand the lived everyday experience and also to ask questions as to the factors that shape these experiences to be what they are and to deliberate how they might be changed so as to relieve suffering and improve the lives of people living with said health issues. And it's also work that has clear practical applications, as are illustrated in this slide. And in the UK, the work out of the Oxford group has been very influential in decisions within the NHS about prioritizations and reform initiatives. As a qualitative sociologist working in public health, this type of work is at the nexus of how I see myself contributing to our professional mission of improving health and saving lives in the years to come. In 1972, the year that I was born, the sociologist David Mechanic, who was actually one of the external advisors for the establishment of HBS, made a strong case for the need of sociology of public health. He clearly distinguished between sociology and public health in an article that he published for a public health audience in AJPH in that year. And he stated that the practice of public health embodies some system or morality, and part of the sociological effort must be devoted to examining this morality and its priorities relative to competing definitions. And along the same lines as Mechanic, Conrad and Barker concluded that social constructionism provides a counter to medicine's deterministic logic in such a way that can broaden and enrich policy deliberations and decisions. In contrast somewhat, in 2005, Bernice Pescasolido, speaking to a sociological audience, made the case for sociology taking a central seat at the big science table, moving inside and collaborating on health research. She recognized that medical sociologists are concerned about losing their critical edge when they move inside and work with scientists and health professionals rather than studying them and their practice, but she warned about the irrelevance to meaningful social change if sociology excludes itself from the work of mainstream health science that is now considering concepts of health that would greatly benefit from our insight. And it's my hope that essentially I can strive to make the best of bringing an outsider perspective to the field of public health that I very much now call my own. I don't seek so much that my work should counter medical or public health viewpoint, but rather that at times I may bring ideas that are complementary to what others of you do or see. My hope is that public health is strengthened by having people within our midst who seek to undertake a careful consideration of why people act in the ways that they do, that does not assume ignorance or willful defiance on the part of the people and the communities to whom we turn our attention, but rather that we should understand that our work necessitates that we seek to step into their shoes as much as possible, see the world from their point of view, consider the factors that shape their behaviors, be they desirable or not, and then consider the appropriate role of public health actors to mindfully step into this space and seek to influence the social context in ways that will serve to benefit individuals, communities, and society as a whole. And I wish to conclude by this presentation with heartfelt thanks. And I don't imagine that I'll ever receive an Academy Award, so this is my opportunity to do that. And I don't believe anybody has music playing, but I'm going to try and keep it pithy-ish. So first to my parents who are here today, who always believed that I could reach the stars, and who gave me the ladder to make it possible and held it steady time and again. Thank you, Mom and Dad. To my son, Brendan, who is the first person who I got to tell that I was promoted to full professor, who inspires me to be a freer thinker and to care about people and places that I've not yet visited. Also, Brendan reminds me on a daily basis that it's important to look good. To my amazing family, I have an amazing family, including my Auntie Mo, who's here today. And those of you who've admired Graduation Barbie in my office, this is the person who knew that this was the perfect gift for the sociologist when she was awarded her PhD. And this was by no means the first Barbie, not even in single digits, that Auntie Mo provided for me. Thank you to my best friends, Katherine and Alex, who inspire me and who've supported me in all aspects of my life, professional and otherwise. And I have the great fortune to work with many wonderful colleagues, both in HBS and throughout JHU. And in particular, I'd like to give great thanks to my 7th floor lunchtime crew colleagues, Deborah, Peg, Eileen, Janice, Anne, Rajiv, Dina, Lori. I also would like to include my mentors, Andrea Gielan, Carl Latkin, who's here today, the rest of you who've just been amazing to work with. I also want to thank my partner on my current major research initiatives, Professor Claire Snyder, who's here, and Professor Joanna Cohen. You're just amazing to work with. To the chairs who've supported me, Don Steinwalks, David Holtgrave, and now Peg Ensminger. Oh, there she is. Thank you so much. Also, to the professors who supported me when I was beginning my career, Professors Melanie Wakefield and Frank Chalupka. Melanie is at the Cancer Council in Victoria, Australia, and Frank is at the University of Illinois at Chicago. They gave me a home in public health and in tobacco control, and without them, I would never have had the capacity to even apply for the job here 16 years ago. I want to say thank you to the wonderful staff in HBS who do everything to make being a faculty member possible, and in particular to Trent Thomas, Nancy Martin, and Christine Massey, who work with me every day. To my current collaborators, Carmen, Kevin, Sajal, Michael, Lisa, Megan, Susan, Elliot, Sharon, Jennifer, Dory, Jill, Taddy, thank you so much for working on in such amazing ways. And finally, last but no means least, I want to thank the JH-SPH students. I have great honor to get to work with you, and I walk with my head held so high, knowing that I play a small role in shaping your thoughts and capacities that will impact the world and go so far beyond my own abilities. It's a true privilege and honor for which I will be ever grateful to the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you.
To give you.
Me too.
But that was fantastic, and I think I did it. I think all the people who have come, and I know a number of you have traveled from outside of Baltimore, is just a testament to what you have contributed and how much you mean to so many people. So congratulations. And your son is applauding. So. Go, Mom. Questions for Kate? Yes.
So I have a question about this last section that you were talking about, the healthy experiences USA, whether you guys are making it. I have a question about the last section and about whether you're making a concerted effort, given our position here, but maybe some of the other partners, about engaging with schools of medicine and how they train their physicians in terms of engaging with this and really trying to understand patient perspectives.
Absolutely, and actually that's a really exciting part of the work. And so the very first module is on young adults and depression, and one of the first applications that has been made of that, so that was out of the University of Wisconsin, has been to build a curriculum for the University of Wisconsin's family medicine residency program to actually use use pieces of these experiences as part of the curriculum, and it has been a pilot project has been implemented and has been evaluated, and it's shown to be at least as effective if and potentially have benefits over some of the existing curriculum structures. So yes, that is very much our hope that that would be one application would be for medical education.
Other questions? Yes.
Thanks. Rosemary Morgan in the International Health. In relation to your study on cancer research, I noticed that a lot of the types of cancer, prostate cancer and breast cancer, very much related to concepts of or biology and what it means to be a man and woman. I was wondering if that came out in your work at all, and especially around in relation to the identity about being a survivor, the fact that maybe they had to have a mastectomy or having certain outcomes as a result of that, and if that was a theme or area that came out.
It was an area that we were very aware of and was part of our design for the study, and one of the reasons that we included non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was to have one cancer that was not specific to one sex or the other. Unfortunately, the study was small, and it was really hard to recruit in NHL, and so we didn't have, even for a qualitative study, very robust numbers there. But I think that the issues around gender and identity were clearly, and so many other aspects of identity were also related to gender when people talked about sort of their familial roles and things, that I think it's an area that would be very worth further consideration, and it was something we just sort of began to pick at in this study and weren't able to fully explore.
Hi, I'm Tara Kirksell. I had the great pleasure of having you as my teacher for a little while, and I think that you've been very influential on the things that I've chosen to do. But my question has to do with the topics that you've chosen throughout your career. Going to a larger picture, how did you choose those things that you were going to spend so much of your time on and so much of your attention at the end of the day, be excited about them and not sort of hate them and think that they were boring?
So I think a little bit has been about areas that are personally meaningful to me. So I began working in public health and in tobacco control, and it was an area that I didn't need to justify to myself or to anyone else why that was important, because it had such tobacco had had such a devastating impact on my family. I think that I am, perhaps to my detriment, excited about things that other people are excited about. And so some of the areas that I've worked in are because people have come into my office and gotten excited about something, and we've torn off in that direction. And I think that issues that are important to public health, either because they're emerging and not well understood, or because they impact a large number of people, or because they impact people that that we know to be vulnerable in a myriad of different ways, are things that have spoken to me. And the last thing is that somebody said to me really early on when I was here as an assistant professor, and for those of you who are at those early stages of your career, this would be advice that I give to you: find people that you like to work with. And that's what I've had the great fortune to do here, both with students and with faculty colleagues, is that there have been just people that I really like, going to meetings with, who work in a way that I find compelling, and that's also driven my work to sometimes to be a little bit broader than other people's work.
Great. Well, again, join me in thanking Kate, and also joining us for a reception at the Wall of Wonder. Thank you.
Thank you.